All right. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. We're here today to talk about the Microsoft Patch Tuesday draft for October 2024 with Rob Brown, and we'll turn it over to Rob to get started.
Thanks so much, Mary, and a very warm welcome to everybody. It is October, a couple of months left of the year, thank goodness. We kind of thought, or we kind of hoped that the trend over the last couple of months that we would have less and less and less work to do, and that is definitely not the case. We have lots to talk about today, starting with the Windows life cycle. Now, these are the feature updates that come with Windows from Windows 10, 11, all the way up to Windows 12 eventually. And these are the operating system upgrades that allow the new operating system to work, new features, new security, and then patches rest upon that. Now, this month we did actually say, or in a couple of days, we are actually going to say goodbye to Windows 10 Enterprise. Super important that you get, Windows 2012 H2. We just said goodbye to that feature update. You must make sure you upgrade to 23 H2. I am also aware that 24 H2 is available as well. But Windows 10 is going end of life next year, and it is going to come very, very quickly. So do plan to move across. Now, there is such a thing as an extended service agreement where you can purchase additional licenses. This has been the case since Windows 7, and currently Windows 2012 is in year 2 of a 3-year term. So if you do still have Windows 2012 devices, you can still purchase that additional license. Next year it'll be year 3, and that would take you up to the 10th of October 2026. If you are a Syxsense customer, we are providing the ESU content, and I imagine if Microsoft is aware that the uptick of Windows 11 hasn't been fully rolled out, there potentially may be an ESU equivalent for Windows 10, but I would not guarantee it. So please make sure if you're using Windows 10, make some project plans to migrate to Windows 11 and keep your environment up to date. Once you've got the latest feature update, you'll have at least 30 months of patching. If you allow your feature update to expire, unfortunately, there won't be any more patches available for you. So it is kind of one of these big steps you have to take, just simply keeping your environment safe. Caesar did give us an update today about Adobe. Very strangely, there isn't Adobe Reader on here, but there is a huge amount of updates for Adobe that's been addressed. Now, these are severity 3 and 4, which basically means that you should install these according to your monthly cadence. Nothing has been weaponized, although it suggests it could be exploited. Nothing actually has at this time. So if you're using Adobe products, as recommended by Caesar, please go ahead and add those into your patch deployment processes. Now, we did have a huge update. Now, this we sort of had 100, then just under 100. Now we have 115 fixes. 3 critical, 108 important, and a few moderate and low. Very interesting, those moderate and lows, because I'll be talking about those in a second, how Microsoft has given the sort of the risk for that particular vulnerability versus the industry experts and the CVSS score that's assigned to it, how there is a different story. But we're going to cover that in a second. Of the 115, 8 are more likely to be weaponized. Now that means that it doesn't. That means it hasn't been weaponized, but potentially the ease of weaponization is there. So do please make sure if you're using Syxsense, this will be very easy. But if you're not using Syxsense, we're going to provide you some steps on a strategy that we've used to deploy over 100 million patches to our managed services customers, just to help our customers build a strategy. More likely to be weaponized if you don't have any other selection criteria should be used as a selection criteria for patch deployment. We can put them into different categories, but weaponize is very, very important, as is weaponization. When something is more likely to be weaponized, it's a risk, but if it is recognized as being weaponized, that's very, very serious. So those should be urgently prioritized for rollout. And if you can only deploy a couple of updates, those are the ones I would recommend first. Public aware is where somebody, potentially a white hat hacker, has published somewhere the kind of blueprint to expose the threat. Maybe they've got a YouTube channel. Maybe they've told the vendor themselves that they're going to publish it somewhere on the internet. And if you look hard enough, you can find these precise steps to actually exploit the vulnerability. Now, if you have both weaponized and public aware together, kind of gives you a double risk. So please make sure you are looking at what is weaponized and what is public aware together. There is actually 2 updates in this Patch Tuesday, which are both weaponized and public aware. And then finally, jump points. Now, jump points, if your mind goes back to the solar winds, that is exactly how such an exploit occurred back then. They came in through one vulnerability. They then jumped to another technology within the customer's environment, and they then continued throughout the environment. There are 7 updates, 7 vulnerabilities, in fact, which have a recognized jump point. If you're familiar with the CVSS, this is called a scope, and that's where scope is changed. It means they can come in through one technology and hop somewhere else. An example I like to give is Hyper-V. If you have a Hyper-V host, which is the server that runs guests on, are you able to jump from the host to the guest and vice versa? And if you can, that makes it very, very serious. So if you have not selected a strategy right now, please go ahead and use weaponization, public aware, jump points, and whether or not it's more likely to be weaponized in your selection criteria. Now, we also like to choose bug types. Now, depending on the bug type, we will prioritize those updates above all else, because the different bug types give us a different exposure to how such a vulnerability might actually threat our environment. The most serious of the vulnerabilities is a remote code execution vulnerability, where we had 41. That's a type of cyber attack or vulnerability that could be exposed through a cyber attack, where they can remotely execute commands to place malware, malicious code, etc., on any devices or networks. Very, very serious. Now, remote code execution appears in the title. It's very easy to see. And if you do have remote code execution vulnerabilities, especially if they are weaponized and public aware, please make sure you prioritize those. Next, we have elevation of privilege. That's a threat actor gains access to an employee's account, bypasses those proper authorization channels, and successfully grants themselves access to data they're not supposed to have. We have 27 of those, followed by denial of service. That's an attacker meant to simply shut down the machine, cause an outage, making it inaccessible. Had 26 of those. And then we have security feature bypass, spoofing, and information disclosure. Those are very serious vulnerabilities as well. For example, security feature bypass is when an attacker bypasses the authentication mechanisms of a device to gain unauthorized access. Now, when you combine all of the data that we have, all these different data points, combining with the bug types, you can very effectively design your priority. And we are aware that not every environment is the same. And there are some environments that potentially have certain certifications that have to be deployed with the highest criticality ones first, followed by the lower categories second. But you also have environments that are distributed across very vast expanse of space, meaning that you can't just deploy huge updates all of the time to all of your devices. So you need to be a bit clever in the selection criteria. Combining all of this data together will actually help you to choose what is the most important, to roll them out in that priority, allowing you over the course of one Patch Tuesday cycle to remediate the vulnerabilities that are most important to you. Now, we can also use our own prioritization. Now, if you're a Syxsense customer, you'll be familiar with this. This is inside your console, where we can combine 6 additional elements or 6 elements together to help prioritize those vulnerabilities for us. In fact, I'm going to do that on the website. If you're familiar with this webcast, we always do put an update on our website, and we do prioritize them in those orders. But to recap, vendor severity is very important that you take the vendor's word for it. But that doesn't always mean that there's a correlation between the vendor's own severity and the risk that is there for that particular vulnerability. Vendor severity goes from critical, high, medium, low, and NA, with critical being the worst, NA being the least worst. And lots of vendors call them also different. So where you might have high, could be important. It's very important that you take that into consideration, but you don't just want to use the vendor's own rating. It's very, very useful to have an additional severity to compare against, which is CVSS. CVSS score is an independently assigned score out of 10. It's calculated both by the vendor and then recalculated by NIST, which actually gives us a sort of a dual approach to selecting patches based on severity. Depending on the ease of use, the accounts that is required to expose that vulnerability, of course, the score increases. 10 being the equivalent of critical, 0 being the equivalent of NA. Now, when you combine those two together and you have the ability to say critical or high severity from the vendor, critical or high severity from CVSS, you'll be surprised how much you see an overlap between the two. And I certainly would want to make sure that that was a minimum for my selection criteria for patching. Weaponization, as I mentioned, is where it's under active exploit. Now, we work with both Microsoft, our third-party vendors, and our antivirus partners to feed all the information into Syxsense that allows us to record when a CVE number, which is the ID of a particular vulnerability, has become exploited. We feed that all into our engine, and then those particular CVEs get marked as weaponized. Weaponization doesn't just occur on critical or high severity vulnerabilities. It actually can happen on medium, low, and NA as well. It's very, very important to track that weaponized status. Public aware, however, doesn't mean, as I mentioned, it is weaponized. And actually lots and lots and lots of public aware vulnerabilities never do get weaponized. Sometimes you have to have a very specific scenario in order to exploit it. In fact, this Patch Tuesday, I've seen more USB style potential vulnerabilities than I've ever seen before. And certainly, if you are outside your work and you find a USB stick on the floor, please throw it in the bin. That's actually now an old school, new school way of trying to exploit vulnerabilities, where you plug in that USB stick, and potentially you can expose your environment. That would be an example of a public aware vulnerability where they know that that kind of threat can occur. Hopefully, you're not going to do that. Now, to balance this priority, you have countermeasures. Now, imagine you've got a 1.5 to 1.8 gigabyte patch that you have to deploy to your 10,000 devices. And a countermeasure exists, which is simply changing a registry key or changing a service type or making a change in Active Directory. That is certainly something you can do much, much faster than actually organizing the rollout of that patch. So keep an eye on any countermeasures that exist. We show you in Syxsense if there is a countermeasure, and the website, the vendor's website, will detail those countermeasures for you. Go ahead and implement those countermeasures, especially if some of those vulnerabilities that aren't the most important will be the next ones coming. Make sure you deploy the countermeasures, and that should hopefully mitigate that vulnerability. If the vendor does suggest that you should remove the countermeasure after you've deployed the patch, please follow the vendor's recommendations. And lastly, it's your exposure. Your exposure is one of the most important aspects of this priority. If you have really, really severe vulnerability with a huge score that is weaponized on just 2 machines of your organization, I would not prioritize that over something that wasn't as severe, but maybe is weaponized and or public aware with no countermeasure. That should become my priority. So I've made a guess that your environment is exposed for some of these vulnerabilities. And therefore, I've made a guess based on that, not knowing your organization, but taking all the other factors into consideration, which ones I would pick on your behalf. And if you're, again, following us regular, thank you for joining. We're actually going to go across to our website. So if you're following along now, come across to syxsense.com. You are actually able to subscribe to this, so you'll actually get the write-ups on Patch Tuesday, although we would love you to still join us on the webinar. There are new things that we learn about those particular threats I like to teach. If you come across to syxsense.com, up on the resources page, you'll find all of the resources where we supply white papers for patch testing or rollout strategies, etc. And of course, these type of webinars as well. If you come over to the resources, you'll find all the links, of which one of them will be the Patch Tuesday from today. And we always call it month, year, and Microsoft Patch Tuesday. Now, I'd mentioned yesterday we had a huge amount, slight typo. There's 155 vulnerabilities. It's actually 115, but everything else is correct. We did have a lot of weaponization. We did have a lot of public aware vulnerabilities. And as I said, 2 of those were both weaponized and public aware. 3 criticals, 108 importance, covering all technology from Windows, components, loads on Hyper-V, loads on RDP. If you're still using RDP, please make sure that that is secured. There are patches still available for it. Office, Visual Studio, SQL Server, and .NET. Now, just because I like to track month on month on month for trend analysis wise, I took all of the vulnerabilities that were released yesterday. I counted all the CVSS scores up together, giving me 849.4. The average, though, the average score for this Patch Tuesday was 7.4. That's actually lower than last month. So although we had loads more vulnerabilities this month than last month, the average were actually more serious last month. That doesn't mean that you don't have to patch. It means that you just have more vulnerabilities to deploy. First one. Now, usually I recommend 3 vulnerabilities, but because we had such a huge number, I actually went to 5. So I've actually gone to extend 5, and I'll explain why a few of these vulnerabilities are almost probably never likely to be exploited, but I think it's responsible. I still mention it anyway. Starting with CVE 2024-43572. This is Microsoft Management Console. If you're an old school IT guy like me, you'll know that MMC snap-ins is your sort of shortcut way to opening up all of your Microsoft apps. Now, not everyone uses MMC still, but still there is a lot used. Now, while it's categorized as moderate severity by Microsoft, it has been weaponized and it is public aware. Why does Microsoft say it's moderate? Well, they're saying that you would have to email this snap-in file and someone would need to then launch it, and that could exploit the vulnerability. So it does require the end user to make a mistake. Guess what? If you place that MMC snap-in inside an IT admin's toolbox, then why would they suspect that that isn't what they expect it to be? So, because MMC snap-ins are just shortcuts, you can unfortunately launch the payload. And because it's a remote code execution, that payload could be ransomware. So please make this a priority, especially if your IT is using MMC snap-ins. Now, it is 7.8 CVSS score, so it's still certainly more severe than the Microsoft's moderate rating. There is no countermeasures. The attack vector is local, so you do need to get access to the network, but has low attack complexity. No privileges required. The user does need to click it, and luckily for us, there's no jump point. The second one is a very interesting one, actually. CVE 2024 43573. This is the Windows MS-HTML platform spoofing vulnerability. Now, we've seen actually MS-HTML quite a lot this year. In fact, this is a second vulnerability where it's moderate in risk, but it is weaponized and it is public aware. Now, if you're familiar, we'd have to sort of cast our minds back. This is a vulnerability that was for the which is designed around Windows 11. Of course, that's retired and depreciated with Edge, and that's all Edge Legacy, and that's actually also now retired as well. Now, the vulnerability allows an attacker to spoof content, potentially manipulate how that site is perceived to the user. So like, you get them to click something, then you're able to exploit. And then why is this important? Because there's still a lot of companies, and I dare say some of our customers as well, that are still relying on that legacy web rendering engine from Windows 11 and Edge. So you can't remove it. So please make sure you do put this into your strategy. If you have any Windows 11 devices or Windows devices running the Edge browser, the legacy Edge browser, please make sure this is included. Now, its risk factor is interesting. So this can be exploited across any network. So if you can get one of those devices to go to this website, you can attack it across the internet. You don't need physical access to the devices. So it's very, very serious. Low attack complexity, no privileges at all by the user. It does require them, the user, to go ahead and click that site. So if your users don't click things like that, that's fine. But if it's an automated kiosk kind of device that you might find in hospitals, etc., or dentists, then I would make sure this is included, because those are the kind of devices where the users aren't trained. Thirdly, very interesting again, CVE 2024 43583. I was kind of looking at this thinking, this is very serious, but it is a very unique vulnerability. I'd actually like to go through it with you. So this elevation of privilege vulnerability in WinLogon. WinLogon is actually what's securing the handling of user logon and session functionality, and it actually rests both locally on the device, but also exists on the domain controller itself. Now, Microsoft has given this an important severity rating, a CVSS of 7.8. And the reason for that is because to exploit this particular vulnerability, you actually need to be brave enough to take your laptop or take a device, go into a company's network, somehow get it connected to that network, and then to bring up an Active Directory domain controller that's also the same name as your existing domain controller. And if you can get on the network and you can call this domain controller the same as whatever that company's domain controller is, then you can actually start sort of your attack, of which it is quite serious, because if you could plan and exploit this attack, then you have privileges as system, which is the highest level of privileges on devices. You could take that system account, take full control, potentially deliver your payload, but what's to stop you from creating accounts that you might want to use for breadcrumbs at a future attack? So very, very serious. But because it requires such a specific attack plan, this is given a sort of a lower severity. But for me, I think this is one of the most important ones. If you're still using premise-based domain controllers, please do make sure this is included in your deployment. Number 4, CVE 2024 20659, Hyper-V, security feature bypass. Now, this is all to do with the sorry, the UEFI, maybe I'm pronouncing that wrong, but it's the firmware interface on the devices. And that leads me to a very interesting vulnerability type that we don't really talk about too much, which is drivers and firmware. Obviously, Microsoft provides us a lot of patches, vendors like Google and Chrome, etc. They provide lots of patches, but you don't really hear about the vulnerabilities that are exploited because they're drivers or firmware. This is one of those examples where I wanted to bring it to your attention. If you are using Hyper-V, please make sure you are including this. It is another public aware vulnerability, but if you don't use Hyper-V, this is probably not one for you. But it does bring the question, are you patching drivers? Are you managing the firmware on your devices and keeping them up to date? Because they are an exploit, just as Microsoft and third-party vendors. And lastly, kind of sounds similar to the first one, but it's not. This is CVE 2024-43468, Microsoft Configuration Manager. So this is not MMC snap-ins, although it looks kind of similar. This is the Microsoft Configuration Manager. Now, this particular attacker could execute arbitrary code on a vulnerable system using the management point in Microsoft Configuration Manager. And by default, it uses the computer account to connect to it. So it's being done through no privileges at all. So as long as you can get onto the network, you're able to exploit this. Now, this is one of the highest CVS score severities of the month at 9.8. So 10 being the very worst, this is one of two vulnerabilities which are 9.8, marked by the vendor also as critical. Now, it's not weaponized and it's not public aware. There is actually a countermeasure. We're going to show you that in a second, where you can find those countermeasures on our post here. The risk factor is across any network, so any network, including the internet. So if you're able to access those devices, you could be exploited. Attack complexity is low, no privileges, and no user interaction. So a user doesn't even have to accidentally click something. This is something that potentially could be exploited, especially if your devices are public facing. Lots and lots of servers are public facing for very, very, very good reasons. Some servers are accidentally public facing. And of course, that's something that we can address later. But first, we need to get this patched. Now, in this list, we've taken a lot of effort into describing the vulnerability severity. Just take the CVE, pop it into your tool set, whichever tool set you have, put that CVE in and see what your exposure is like for these in, say, take the first 10 and put your exposure next to it. Anything which is the highest exposure, please go ahead and resolve those. If you could put the 2 at the top there, which are already exploited, please do that by default. The additional details column here will actually explain what you need to do to resolve the issue. If in fact there is a countermeasure, it will go ahead and explain it here, which could include things like in this case, you can make some changes to the account, or you can change some of your security to make computer accounts less likely to be used in this kind of attack. The rest of the vulnerabilities are listed beneath. I hope you find this really useful. It is October. Of course, we have a couple of big events coming up. It's getting into the spooky season, and early next month, we've got a fireworks night. So I know it's very serious. I hope this has helped. I really look forward to seeing you again in November. And until next time, happy patching. Thank you.